This is the Reading with Rochelle podcast, where we will explore history we never learned in school but wish we had. I'm Rochelle Chase, an author and a columnist, and this week's book is We Are Each Other's Harvest, Celebrating African American Farmers' Land and Legacy by Natalie Baszile, and my guest is Denise Greer Jamerson. Denise Greer Jamerson lives in Lyles Station, the last remaining Black settlement in Indiana. This farming settlement was officially named Lyles Station in 1886, but Denise's family has been farming there since 1855. In fact, the Smithsonian has recognized Denise's father, Norman Greer, as one of the last remaining African American farmers who's still farming land that's been in their family since before the Civil War. In this episode, we discuss the fascinating history of Lyles Station and Greer Farms, along with the challenges faced by Black farmers. We also discuss what the Greer's organization, Legacy Taste of the Garden, is doing to empower BIPOC, that is, Black, Indigenous, people of color, farmers in Indiana, and more. While we touch upon We Are Each Other's Harvest, this episode isn't a direct discussion of the book. Instead, it supplements the book by providing a glimpse into the experiences of a Black farming family in the Midwest. Check out the show notes for my book review of We Are Each Other's Harvest, Celebrating African American Farmers' Land and Legacy, along with information on Denise Greer Jamerson and others mentioned in this interview. Okay, Denise, welcome to Reading with Rochelle.
Thank you.
When I met you at the Farmers of Color conference in Iowa at the end of this year in 2024, and I heard you speak, I thought, okay, you would be the perfect person to chat about when discussing this book, We Are Each Other's Harvest, Celebrating African American Farmers' Land and Legacy by Natalie Baszile. First of all, I want to ask you, though, just to give a little bit of information, because your history is very interesting about your farm in Lyles Station and actually the town itself. So maybe you could start with just a little bit about the town and then tell us a little bit about your farm.
Thank you for having me today. Lyles Station is the last remaining African American settlement in Indiana. It was a farming settlement, and as we all know, there were a lot of settlements. We're called Black pioneers and coming back after emancipation. My family's farm actually has been farming since pre-Civil War, since 1855 here in Lyles Station. So a lot of people came here and settled and began farming. That's what they knew. It was a part of living. Homesteading is what people call homesteading today, but it was actually people coming to this community, finding a place to start their families, start their homes. Some of the people that came to Lyles Station went back and told people, which is how we began to grow in this area. Lyles Station had the first Black postmaster north of the Mason-Dixon line. The residents from Lyles Station donated property to the railroad so that they could bring a railroad down through here. And this was a stop that people could get off. Black people could get off of the train here. But it was also a means and a ways for us to get our products out of Lyles Station. Lyles Station in its zenith had a grocery store. It had the post office. It had the band, a lumber mill. Like I said, it was a farming community. In its zenith, it had over 800 families. People started leaving farming. So now we have a remnant here in Lyles Station, but we're still here. We have created a museum out of a school because here in this area, we had maybe 7 settlements, and they all came together and created a school, a consolidated school for the children here in Lyles Station. So we have preserved that school as a museum for people to come and see how we live, how Black farmers farm and stuff like that here in Lyles Station, as a way for all the descendants to come back to Lyles Station to home. A lot of people from Lyles Station have done a lot of things. We had Alonzo Fields, who served 4 administrations in the White House as the chief butler that came from Lyles Station, a lot of educators from Lyles Station, a lot of the first mayor of Grand Rapids, Michigan came from Lyles Station. So there's a lot of people that have been dispersed all across the United States that by staying here, they can come back home and touch the history, live the history, understand the history, and continue to pass on the wonderful history of the people of Lyles Station, how we lived, how we survived, and how this is now it's becoming so much more important that these generations learn this life and that it is a good life and being self-sustaining as people. So that's a little bit about Lyles Station. And like I said, my family is still here, as well as other families that are still here and our absent landowners who have hung on to the land and are continuing to hang on to the land. My father is recognized in the Smithsonian as one of the last remaining African American farmers who is still farming land that's been in our family pre-Civil War. So it is really important to me. We have created Legacy Taste of the Garden as an extension of Greer Farms. My dad does row crop farming. My son does produce farming. My son and me and my husband, and we do the education and advocacy because we recognize that how I grew up with farmers, that seeing them go away, how important and the gap that there is in what people understand about farming. So Legacy is a produce farm, but we also do the education and advocacy in order to help people to learn more about agriculture and to have options for people who have land other than selling it, to keep it in our hands.
It's fascinating. Let me go back to the town for a minute. When you say Lyles Station, you had about 800 families. Was there like one person who kind of founded this town? I mean, how did people hear about it? I mean, at the very beginning.
Well, you have to understand that when it was established, before it was even named Lyles Station, it was a colony of Black people who came here. Where Lyles Station is located, we're like on the Wabash River. We're Wabash, and I think there's another river that it joins into. So we're
Hmm.
right on the banks of a couple of rivers, and there were salt
Mm.
mines and stuff. So some of the people could come down here and work. Being close to that river was another way to get out products and people to come here. For me and my family, Levi Greer, who was a white man, came here and settled with his woman and 8 children. So it was at a time when people were leaving the South, where they were coming to the North for freedom. They were being pioneers coming to this land. So not only did my family come, there were other families who came. But 100 years later is when it got the name Lyles Station, and that's Joshua Lyles is the one who donated the land to the railroad in order for us to get our goods out. So it was named Lyles Station.
I see. Okay. And so you said your family was one of the original families then coming to Lyles Station?
Yes,
And that was about 1855?
more like 1840. In the 1840s, yeah, and so there was some other people, there was another person named Charles Greer that maybe even came before that, but my lineage came from Levi, and we're still kinda trying to tie it back to I know that it had to be probably the same family that came even before Levi. So Levi came in the 1840s with his yeah.
Wow. And so today, are there many Black farmers left there?
So when you say Black farmers, to me, I think about my dad, and that was his life. He didn't have an outside life, right? He farmed. He was an entrepreneur that farmed. So when I talk about people like him, there's a couple. But when I talk about landowners and people who have other jobs that may be ranchers, or they have small acreage that they farm, there's still probably a good number here. I'd say maybe 5 to 10, but we still have a lot of landowners who their land so, like, my dad does work for his cousins on their land. So they're still landowners, and then they rent out the land to dad, and dad farms their land.
Hmm.
Got it.
So
So do you know from a historical perspective, like how the farm has changed? Like, okay, so if it's 1840, about how many acres did you have? How many, what kind of crops were you growing? Do you have kind of that history of your farm?
when people think about farms now, they think industrial farms. But when you got to think about farming in the 1800s, it's like the people who came here, they came here with seeds in their hair. Okay, like I had mentioned at the conference, there's a book called The Bone and the Sinew, which is where it talks about how many Black settlements and colonies were in the Midwest. And when you think about that, and like I said, in that book, she talks about how this place was all wooded and it was, in a sense, swampland. But they came here and they made this land fertile. But they had to remove trees, they had to do a whole lot of things just to come here and settle. You see, so like the land that is in our family was a homestead. So it was 40, the particular piece was 40 acres, but each child got a portion of 40 acres and there was 9 kids. So that was like 300 and something acres. That was my great great grandfather's, right? So over time, some of those family members may have lost their piece, or we still have a good amount of that, but it was a homestead. And on that homestead, it was 40 acres. And on that 40 acres, they grew the food they eat. They grew the food that their animals needed. So it was a homestead. So it wasn't like it was a bunch of acres being farmed. And this is how it was for everybody in this community. So everybody was farmers in a sense, not unless they were like a lumber mill. But at the same time, when I talked to my dad, he says everybody had a cow because everybody milked their cows. They didn't eat beef, but they had the cows to milk their cows, or everybody had chickens. Like, so say like the people who had a lumber mill, they may have had their homestead, but that's how they bartered and sold things. My grandpa needed a wagon, so he went to the lumber mill to get it for them to build the wagon, but they may have bartered other things of food and stuff like that in order to get the things that they needed, because everybody has different talents, because there were teachers, there were the people who taught the kids at the school. So but they may have still lived on a homestead, because even during the day, during this harvest season, kids would get out of school to go help the family harvest. Because when you talk about farming, and my dad's talking about a corn crib, they actually had to shell the corn with their hands. It wasn't like a combine like he has now. He has a machine that he goes through the field and he harvests the corn. But when he was a kid, he was riding on a mule. He had a team of mules that they had to feed, that they had to use. And so the way that it just has evolved. So when you talk about farm in the 1840s opposed to the farm now, when people are talking of hundreds of acres, but it's really going back to, my dad always talks about, it's going back to that homestead, that 40 acres. It's going to have to go back to that because of the way agriculture has just grown out, is growing out of control,
Right. I,
the way that he did it.
I think you touched upon when you're talking about homesteading and you're talking about people doing things by hand, and it was a lot different then. I think one of the things she mentions in the book is about the community aspect of farming as well. Like when you had these communities, people got together and they did help each other doing that. Is that something that you experienced as well?
That's our life at Lyles
Maybe
Station.
not you personally, but I
No, but
mean
that is
now
our
and
life.
then.
That is our life here at Lyles Station. I mean, I got married, moved away, and ended up coming back home. But I brought my kids when they were smaller. So they have been able to experience this community type of life. So it's like when my son decided to go into farming, he was growing up and he worked with my uncles who did produce, but they passed away before he decided to go into farming. But the other men would come alongside and teach him and talk to him and mentor him, and anything that he needs, they are there for him. You know what I'm saying? So because it's like we all grew up in a farm. Right now, if I needed anything, I know that my community's got my back. It doesn't matter that they're old like my dad, they're going to do what they can do. Plus they have kids, which we have all grown up in a family sense, because along with the school was the church where we all went to church here in Lyles Station. So it's about building those relationships and building that, expanding out that community family, and if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Another thing that I think was brought up in the book, there were so many different examples, not only of the successes and people succeeding despite challenges, despite the odds, but then they mentioned like so many obstacles that Black farmers had as it relates to either the USDA or the various agencies. Were there any of those kind of challenges that your family experienced?
Always. Yes.
I feel like that's an
Yeah.
I can't assume.
Yeah, it can't. You can't. And it's really, I listened to Todd Western and his brother's interview about how they were growing up with their dad. And it's really interesting to me how what the things that our fathers had to do in order to maintain. So their dads, when they spoke, they talked about their dad wanted to stay under the radar so that they couldn't know what they were doing in order to try to hinder them from what they were doing. For me, and from my viewpoint of me growing up, my dad came from very, very humble beginnings, right? He left, went to the military, and came back. He tried to work for somebody, and he ended up telling him, you know what, you'll end up working for me one day, because he just couldn't do this, right? So in his rise, they didn't like it, to put it nicely. He was very visible in the things that he was doing. So say like he was the first one to get a grain bin, and then all of a sudden he was stifled in being able to get stuff when other people were growing, right? So they were seeing what he was doing and wasn't liking seeing what he was doing. And the thing about it is this stuff is kind of documented in his case with the USDA, because he very much had to deal with not getting funding on time if he wanted to apply from the USDA. And then when he would get the funding, it was so restrictive that everything, the hoops he had to jump to just to access it. You know what I mean? So this compiled over years and years ended up in a big ball of debt to the USDA, I should say, which was accelerated. It was accelerated to call in for the loans. And then therefore there's still their tactics. You can't pay the principal. You got to pay all this interest, which was 3 or 4 times what the real principal was. He had a friend that lost everything. And for me and my family, my dad had 5 daughters. His best friend had 5 sons. So his 5 sons had farmed the land, had done a crop, and they still wouldn't let them buy the farm back. It is really tiptoeing through your progress, tiptoeing through what is perceived and what is assumed for you as a farmer. But my dad, he just was going, he out of the county. He was blessed to get acreage to do custom farming. He was able to do so many different things that today he's good. Although you took 183 acres from him, he's still favored enough that this is what he was supposed to be doing, that he was smart enough to do. You know what I mean? Like when they took his land, being smart, he waited till he got to the table and said, okay, well, what about my mineral rights? They hadn't thought about that. So they still had to give him a third of his mineral rights. And then the other farmers in this area were able to acquire his land at minimal cost. And they're getting that other 2/3 of his mineral rights.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's very
So
similar to the horror stories that, were in the book as well. Oh my gosh.
you can just change the names, but the stories are the same.
Exactly. And every time I read them and I hear these stories, I'm always amazed again that the resilience and the persistence and the fact that, as Black people, we've been able to accomplish these things in spite of all of these things that we don't get to take advantage of that others have. So it's like I see this a lot in a lot of things, and I definitely see this in the farming area.
Most definitely.
So you have talked about, I think you talked a little bit about regeneration at the conference. First of all, if you could explain, just define what that is and how that has affected your farm.
Okay, so regenerative farming is being able to regenerate, bring life back to the soil by using certain practices. But I kind of spun that to regeneration, like the torch is being passed to like my generation and Mr. Todd's generation and the people who are around me to where the torch is getting ready to be passed on this land ownership. So how do we regenerate our lives and our lifestyles of farming? Because again, not just for Black farmers, but farming in the US in general is coming into a big change. Right now, when my dad started, he was free to farm. Now he's not free to farm, and when I say that, it's because the fertilizer is controlled, the seed is controlled, the price that you get for the seed once you harvest it is controlled. So when all of that is controlled, just like a one piece of equipment is $1 million. Nobody can afford that. I mean, but at the same time, how many harvests would it take to pay that off? And then we have to talk about Black farmers because that's what I know. I'll just put it like that. That's what I know. We don't get any extra programs. We don't get any lease agreement. We don't get any of that other stuff that probably helps it to maybe help. But still, when our country is at a point to where maybe our grain is not going to be sold to China anymore because the system has been set up that all this grain gets shipped out of the United States and it's not necessarily feeding our people. That's why it's so important about the regional food business centers. And what COVID showed us is that we need to build these systems with the food that we're growing for the people in our country. So when I'm talking about the regeneration of the farms, what is going to happen when my dad is not farming anymore? Not only to my land, but to my cousin's lands, to all these other landowners. And will it be that we change it over from row crops to a specialty crop that feed the people? And knowing those options and like I'm saying, the regeneration of successful succession planning. We got to rethink the things that our fathers did. And some of us, like I said, for Todd and them, it was a tragic situation to where they had to jump into it. But I'm blessed, although it's still tough, to still have my dad here to kind of think about what do I do in the next step and what are the options and how do we maneuver with the climate smart initiatives? How does my son step into this farming arena the way it looks now? And being able to make it be successful.
Right. Right. Can you talk a little bit about the legacy, the taste of the garden? Can you talk a little bit about more about that and what that is, what you're doing now?
Okay, so with Legacy Taste of the Garden, like I said, down here in Lyles Station, one thing that was common is everybody grew their own gardens. When I grew up, everybody was a lot more people growing. So the same thing for my kids. My son worked with my uncle in the watermelon field. He's been exposed to this farming community, so he decided he wanted to go into farming, especially when it was a wake-up call when the Smithsonian came and took our dirt and the importance of our family and this legacy continuing on and growing the produce along and providing a produce along with teaching about Black farming because of it being extinct and the importance and a lot of people don't understand the lifestyle and the freedom of a farming lifestyle and eating your own food or growing your own food. So we also wanted to step into kind of changing the narrative of my dad sitting on a cloud of dust to my son teaching people at a community church how to grow food and their image of what agriculture is. Agriculture is not somebody sitting on a tractor. Agriculture is everything that you do. Anything that you pretty much anything that you can touch is agriculture. And as we stepped into this, we seen the hope that it gave to kids. And then we also was working with the NRCS to educate the people who are wanting to go into growing their own food and the programs that are out there. and the opportunities that are out there. So when COVID happened, we were able to work with Partnership for Healthy America, which was an initiative that Michelle Obama had put into place outside of the normal USDA food box programs, because these food boxes were not coming into our communities. So we were able to connect with this organization to help get the food into the areas that wasn't getting the food. So we tailored a conference called the Black Loom around Indiana, the state of Indiana, with the partners that we had throughout the state to bring in information to the people who want to farm that are in the urban areas. When we went back to the city to do produce, we seen the food deserts. We were like, people need the food. And then like for us, we would go to conferences outside of Indiana and learn things, but come back to the offices and they would be like, well, where did you get that information? And how did you know about that information? And in all fairness to those agencies, they get information all the time. And sometimes they may not have gotten it. So, or somebody in the office that has since moved gotten it. And so it's like, wait a minute. But when you can build a relationship with those county offices, then you can find out more information. They're more comfortable with saying, hey, this is coming out. Let me help you with this. So we, instead of just doing like one conference, we went to these areas where we knew there were urban farmers or there were people, urban growers or producers, so that they could start building relationship with these agencies in their areas. And then we also worked with people across the United States, working with HBCUs on doing conferences and bringing services and telling about the USDA programs and services too. So we are all around just trying to help the Black farming community, the people who want to grow, getting the information to them, connecting them into networks, whatever Legacy can do to help people build on their legacy, learn about their legacy, or start a legacy. Any way that we could do, that's what we try to tap into.
That's awesome. That's awesome work. And you've been doing this for how long?
We started Legacy Taste of the Garden in 2017. We've been growing all along, and Greer Farms has been there all along. So, and just trying to really not only networking, but building the regional food business, regional food distributions to our communities where the food deserts were planned. They were not by happenstance. So we got to be able to feed our own people, and let's connect and let's do what we have to do to make sure that we're all fed.
Well, this is awesome. That's awesome work that you're doing. And it's awesome. It's really inspiring that you have held your family farm so long and gotten the recognition for that, and they're helping others. That's awesome. Is there anything else that you want to add about your farm that I haven't asked you?
I just have such a respect for the people in the book because I've watched my father and I've been able to watch this community. And I think as I grow, it just makes me have such a much more respect for the resiliency of these Black farmers. Because, like I said, it's one thing for people to hear the stories, for people to hear the the USDA case, but but people live that. People are have and what are the effects on the people that have lived through that? And there just has to be, I just think that there just needs to be a high level of respect for these farmers, these Black farmers that have been holding it down for us and our people from day one, and their families. And I just really want the story to get out so that there can be some support for them. We had Reverend Al Sampson. I don't know if people are aware of him, but he worked with Martin Luther King, and he talks about how it was the Black farmers that fed like Martin Luther King and their people when they were doing these riots. It was the Black farmers who came through and gave money to get them out of jail. It was the Black farmers that are holding this down, and there needs to be a respect and a reverence. I would like to see them do a historical designation for Black farms and Black land that still exists. But yeah, for me, it's just the total respect for the Black farmers. Like I said, when I read the book, it's just so heart wrenching. It is.
Well, it's stories like yours. I mean,
It's all the same.
it's heart-wrenching. And then, like I said, it's stories like yours and these other farms that have managed to accomplish so much with so little like little help in terms of like other white farmers have gotten. But yet and still, you've been resilient and you've lasted and you've persisted, and it's just admirable. And it's just amazing to me what you've had to go through. My family on my mom's side came from farming, and so I have this interest in that as well. And it's just also just seeing their story as well. It's just amazing to me. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you taking the time to be on Reading with Rochelle. And if you want to share your website where people can go to find out more about you, that would be great.
Okay, thank you. We're at www.legacytasteofthegarden.com. That's one word. And then you can find us also on Facebook and Instagram.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.